Hello, everyone. If you enjoy the story, please consider supporting the author by going to the link in the description to Amazon to pre-order the book for yourself. It costs 99 cents and it'll be out on April 20th for you to enjoy on any of your electronic devices. It seemed obvious that someone was going to die. I ran down the hallway with Dr. Scrit and the janitor. I ran until my lungs told me to stop, and then I kept going. At some point, the janitor wasn't with us anymore, or perhaps he was, but not physically. At any rate, only Dr. Scrit and I arrived at the room where Gralt and Falhar were fighting. The latter had pinned the former to the ground. I recognized a familiar list clutched in Dr. Gralt's hand. They each outweighed me by an easy 100 pounds. I stared at them and froze, realizing that I was powerless to stop them. Dr. Scrit, whose frame was essentially identical to mine, pushed past me. "Hey!" she screamed. "Cut that shit out!"
But he took my...
"Now!" Then Dr. Scrit turned around and walked out the door. The two doctors did not react at first. Then Falhar slowly stood and backed away from Gralt, who was shakily getting to his feet. I lifted my jaw back into place, then turned to leave.
I still know what you did,
came the whisper from behind me. I wheeled back around. Dr. Gralt was staring incredulously at Dr. Falhar.
"You're completely insane. You know that, right?"
Falhar lunged, and the next several seconds blurred confusingly around me. Slowly, I realized that I had jumped between them to hold Dr. Falhar back. He was crying.
I didn't kill him 5 years ago, and I've been regretting it every day since.
His face turned ashen as he struggled to find his next words. I turned to see Dr. Gralt pressed against the wall, terrified. He was pudgy enough as it was, and all I could imagine was a scared-looking Pillsbury doughboy with a trembling, scrubs-covered gut. I rolled my eyes and faced Dr. Falhar. "Did you break a rule?" His eyes brimmed with tears. I understood that he was breaking, and it irritated the fuck out of me. I'd use shorter sentences, but my initial query only had 5 words, and English syntax prohibits me from dumbing it down any farther. It came from my mouth as though someone else were speaking. I thought of the space between the doors and wondered just how much of myself had been burned away.
I looked in room 825.
Saw something from the past that triggered the ammonia smell that tells me your scrubs are going out with the trash? I snapped. "Listen," I continued in a more soothing voice. "Why don't you head back to the break room and drink a nice warm cup of get the fuck over yourself, then come back when you're ready to undertake the monumental task of executing your employment obligations without committing homicide." He stared at me like I'm an idiot. Because if I can get over myself, anyone can. The words spilled like water flushing down a drain, leaving me empty but clean. I turned to see Dr. Scrit's reflection in a glass cabinet. She was smiling. 6 of us endured the first year. Falhar was among them. Gralt was not. People, doctors, and ghosts came and went. Most carried a faulty sense of permanence about their own presence, shocked when the next turn of life's wheel replaced their carefully constructed niche with someone equally dispensable. I endured. There wasn't a specific moment when I realized I wanted to be the chief of medicine, nor even one where I realized I wanted it. The drive built slowly within me, and I was halfway down the road before I realized where I was going. Years passed. St. Francis Hospital did not cease to become strange, but I made a conscious decision to stop trying to understand it. I gradually became to appreciate just how odd human beings are. Accepting the quirks of the hospital was much easier in that context. I still cremated children immediately after offering efficient condolences to their parents. I never went onto the roof, and I quietly ignored room 1913 whenever it mysteriously appeared. I was sitting across from Dr. Scrit when she opened a thank you note from a patient that she diagnosed and eventually saved. Despite being several hundred words long, she tossed it in the trash after a 2-second glance. "Do you know that Vivian means life?" I asked. She snorted. "I am what I do. People hate that reality, which is the only reason they assign names in the first place." The next big change was coming soon. It infused my thoughts like damp air whispering of a coming storm. I thought I was ready for it, which proved that some lessons are never learned. I'd been walking through the same hallway that drew me in years earlier. On that day, only a familiar janitor haunted its walls. I'd seen him periodically throughout the years, rarely talking and never aging. This time, however, he looked right at me and spoke.
It's time to make a choice, Ellie.
He explained softly. My blood froze. He turned aside and looked toward a space in the wall that had only occasionally held a physical door. It stood there now, slightly ajar. The numbers were etched deeply into the wood, warped and worn like they had been there for years. Why does it say 3191? I asked. He smiled sadly.
It's your opportunity to go backwards.
I swallowed. I'd gotten used to tricking myself into confidence by imitating others, but felt weak in this moment. Where does it lead? I asked shakily.
Rural, Missouri.
He continued in a paternal voice.
Far from any town, about 30 minutes away from Drisking.
He raised his eyebrows.
But that's not the real question, now, is it?
I closed my eyes. When does it lead? He waited until I looked at him once again before he continued.
August 25th, 2005.
I wiped away a tear. Can it go any earlier?
No.
He responded quickly. I'd have very little time to prepare.
The world turns on what people do with very little.
I dried my face, but was quickly losing control of myself. Okay, I responded, voice shaking. I need to go back. I took a deep breath. I can be ready in a few days. Where will I find the door? The janitor stood very still.
Right here. Right now.
My stomach dropped. No. I'm not ready right this second. I need to prepare if my life is going to change. The tears and snot were flowing unabated, and I was losing the will to stop them. He folded his hands quietly.
If you don't go now, the door disappears. You'll never see it again.
I fell to my knees. What choice did I have? Okay, I whispered. Okay, I'll go now. I looked up. When I come back, will the world be different? He was silent for a beat. Then,
you can only go back the hard way, Ellie.
My stomach plummeted. That was 26 years ago. I can't lose that much of my life. He sighed.
Yes, you can. People lose that much every day.
I sobbed once. Well, I don't understand. Is my body going to reverse an age, or will I just like this and die 26 years earlier?
You don't get any extra time, Ellie.
He continued with a patient voice.
Any year that you live twice takes away from what would have been.
I barely suppressed the urge to vomit. But, I gasped. But will it be like the last time I'm back? Or will I be able to change things now? He smiled, more joyfully this time, but still tinged with the sadness that I suspected was a permanent condition of his existence.
The past will be yours to change as you decide. The world will be different as a result of your choices.
Adrenaline shot through me.
Ellie,
he continued.
You always knew that last part was true, right?
The floodgates opened, and I ugly cried. I pitched forward, pressing my hands against the floor. I need time to process this.
You don't have time, and you don't need it. Right now you have to step through that door or walk away forever.
He reached out, grabbed the knob, and began to pull it shut. We like to pretend that grave decisions take time because it allows us to believe that deep thought changes our basest instincts. But we are our truest selves in short moments of high consequence. So I leapt to my feet. I squeezed through the door just as he closed it behind me one last time. They say a new door opens every time a different one closes, but that's a bunch of horse shit for people too afraid to admit that the past is gone. The door closed behind me with a dead sound. I was in a hallway at St. Francis Hospital. I turned around to see the door to the same janitor's closet where I had first read a list of rules all those years ago. Cautiously, I opened it and peeked inside. The noxious smell of ammonia greeted me as I reached for the bare bulb and pulled the chain. Sallow light illuminated a neglected storage space and nothing more.
You won't get into Narnia again by that route.
A voice shot from behind me. I wheeled around to find the familiar janitor standing patiently next to me with his hands in his pockets. I'd gotten very good at reading faces over the years, of dealing with dying and otherwise incompetent people, but I could not for the life of me gauge what was happening behind his eyes. He was the same age that he had always been, so there was no way to tell what year was happening around me. Then I heard a buzz from a Nokia push-button cell phone on a nearby counter. I looked up at the boxy television hanging from the ceiling. It featured a grainy presentation of American Idol with Simon Cowell, who was apparently still alive. I reached for my pocket to grab my iPhone 1X, only to remember that I'd left it in a different coat. My head spun.
They're waiting for you.
The janitor responded simply, his hand outstretched. Dazedly, I took 3 steps in the direction he'd indicated. Then I turned back, and he was gone. So I put one foot in front of the other, determined to keep moving until I figured out where the hell I was supposed to go.
You're early.
A voice called out.
There's an auspicious beginning.
I scanned the hall until I realized that I was approaching Dr. Scritt's office. The voice was coming from inside. I went through the door. The room was decorated hideously, and I suddenly felt a wave of appreciation for the style that Dr. Scritt would eventually bring. A storm raging outside nicely complemented the mood evoked by the taupe and gray curtains. A short, balding man waddled over to me, hand outstretched. His clothing style echoed the can't groom myself motif that his general appearance exuded, and I hoped for his sake that he compensated in intellect what he lacked in physical appeal.
Jerry Ringwater, CFO. Pleased to meet you. The higher-ups have been foretelling your arrival for a while now.
He grasped my hand with a small, clammy palm and shook vigorously.
Between you and me,
He muttered in a lower voice.
I think it's about damn time St. Francis had a woman chief of medicine.
He winked. I looked up to see 6 hospital administrators. Their number included John Stevens, looking years younger and much healthier than when I'd last seen him in a casket. At this point in the timeline, he hadn't quite yet inherited Mr. Ringwater's job. I clenched my sphincter to avoid painting the floor with shock.
By the way,
Jerry continued, raising his voice for the group of people behind him.
the higher-ups explained that you've just legally changed your name. I have to apologize, but they did not inform us of your new moniker. What should we call you, Dr.?
I looked up at the glass cabinet behind the desk, and my reflection looked blurrily back. I needed glasses. Thin spectacles, to be precise. In another 14 years, I'd be her spitting image. Oh shit. Fuck my life, I whispered.
Pardon me?
Jerry responded, flabbergasted. I turned sharply on him and narrowed my eyes. I said, Vivian Scritt. My name means life. He paled slightly and swallowed.
Of course, Dr. Scritt. My apologies.
He took 2 small steps back from me.
Would you like to meet Dr. Matthews, our chief of surgery?
My mind was slowly wrapping itself around the new reality that was impossible yet omnipresent. Not one hidden wisp of the real world remained. I felt vertigo as I understood just how frail the gossamer strands of our existence truly are, and wondered whether dying is another way of admitting that we were never real. A sudden shock of urgency rocked through my aching head, and I had to reclench my sphincter. Date! I yelled, grabbing Jerry's flabby biceps hard enough to make him wince. What's the date today? He stared at my hand, slack-jawed, and was unable to answer before John Stevens interrupted us.
Ah, Dr. Scritt. Meet our chief of surgery, Dr. I need you to come with me right now.
Shot a tall man in scrubs as he was rushing towards us, panic carved into his eyeballs.
Are you officially the chief of medicine?
I was about to look around the group for confirmation, but an invisible force turned my head away from them and made me step confidently forward. Jerry spoke up from behind me.
She's...
Already on the clock, as are the rest of you. Thank you for showing yourselves out, ladies and gentlemen. Now, Dr. Matthews, I'm Dr. Vivian Scritt. Let's walk and talk. He had the essence of a man who eschewed dealing in bullshit. I liked this fact, but it increased my growing sense of panic given how nervous he was.
Doctor, I've never seen anything like it. 19 minutes ago, the school bus rolled down an embankment. At least 13 deaths have been confirmed. The storm has shut down half the roads in Charleston. At least 6 of my surgeons are unable to find a way to get to the hospital.
This was it. I suppose I also ought to speak the part. You're giving me a school bus full of dead children on my first day as chief of medicine? I asked a very pale Dr. Matthews.
Well, no. Most of them are. Well, they're alive for the moment, Dr. Scritt.
I closed my eyes and allowed the lightning bolt of pre-migraine to tear through my head unabated, lapping at the frayed gray matter of my skull like a cat teasing every drop of milk from the depths of his bowl with a sandpapery tongue. For 3 seconds. Then I breathed out calmly, accepting and embracing the lingering pain as a part of my psyche that would propel me forward. How far out are the first ambulances? Dr. Matthews swallowed.
They should be at St. Francis within 4 minutes. The same flood that washed out the bus has shut down the Interstate 77 bridge over the Elk River, so...
Are you telling me that Charleston Area Medical can't take any of the kids?
Well, that's kind of exactly what I'm saying.
My headache enriched. How many surgeries are we going to need to perform? I asked. He winced.
We're anticipating 12.
12? That storm is terrible. Why the hell was a school bus out in the... Never mind. Let's get the circus tent pitched. We're very understaffed for this shit and don't have nearly enough pediatric surgeons on a good day. I sighed deeply and ran the numbers in my head. Looks like a couple of interns are about to experience their first solo procedures. He nodded, turned, and raced down the hallway. I knew, of course, where this road was headed, and I was determined that this time would be different. My mind was still reeling from the fact that my life had completely turned upside down, but I pushed the thoughts to the recesses of my mind. That ability is crucial in a hospital. I had a bus full of dying children to think about. I needed to be confident in the abilities of Dr. Vivian Scritt. I didn't know whether that confidence came from the outside world or if I generated it myself and put it out for all to see. I was pretty sure that both opposing ideas were true at the same time, and that simply believing made the idea real enough to have faith in it. My head spun. I shouted at the surgical team. We don't have enough operating rooms in the pediatric surgical unit. These kids don't have enough doctors for everyone to get a surgeon, and I don't have enough patients to put up with any donkey shit. I'm Dr. Scritt, and you work for me now. Dr. Matthews, how many surgeons do we have ready to go? His head jerked to attention like it was caught in a fishing line, and I felt a surge of strength at the fear I could feel radiating from him.
9, and 10 if you take a patient yourself, Miss, Dr. Scritt.
He cleared his throat.
I've got 4 nurses scrambling to make calls, but it's not looking good. Most of the streets are completely flooded, and everyone who's attempted to drive here has gotten stranded. We tried contacting everyone we can, but the storm knocked the landline phones out, and it's crippling our cell reception. We're admittedly caught off guard. It's really a freak storm for August.
Well, I stopped short. What's the date? I whispered to him.
It's Thursday. August 25th.
Vertigo hit me so hard that it felt like my asshole was turning inside out. Excuse me. I dashed out of the room and headed down the hallway. Before I could make it back into my own office, I dove into a familiar janitor's closet. I wanted to cry, but I was shaking too much. I looked down at my watch. My childhood home was going to burn down in an hour. My brother was still alive. Thoughts flitted independently across my brain like 15 border collies on crack. They need me now. Timmy needs me now. The landlines are out. I'm needed in surgery. Someone is going to die. It is going to be my fault. You have 5 seconds to keep shaking and feeling sorry for yourself before you go out the door and decide whose life changes forever. I didn't think I could do it. Then I opened the door and walked outside. Dr. Matthews, it seems we're at least 2 surgeons short. How can you help me out? He looked at me steadily, but still with a hint of fear. I fed on it.
Well, it's not ideal, but I think we'll have to put some interns on solo procedures.
He winced. My stomach turned to clay. Who do you have in mind?
Doctors Yankston and Branning have been doing very well.
I closed my eyes. Who else do you have? He wouldn't speak until I looked straight at him.
Dr. Scrit, I don't know how they do things where you come from, but it's not customary for first-year interns to...
Desperate, shitty times call for desperate, shitty measures, Doctor. Who else do you have? His face grew ashen.
No one that I could, in good conscience, trust with the life of a child.
I was about to cry. There was no stopping it. Then the doors burst open, and everything changed. Game time. Orders fired from my mouth before thought could form. Everyone followed what I told them to do. Get me a phone, I shouted to one nurse. I looked down seconds later to find I'd been given one.
Dr. Scrit, there are 3 more patients awaiting in OR.
I grabbed Dr. Matthews' arm. What are the simplest procedures that these kids need right now? He swallowed.
It looks like a deep leg laceration on a male, 10 years old, and an abdominal laceration on a female, also 10. No signs of damage to any major organs.
I'm going to take one of those patients, pair Tweedledee and Tweedledum with the other, and keep them close enough to...
Dr. Scrit, 3 other children are in cardiac arrest. Are you really going to...
I need to make a phone call.
You're needed in surgery.
I'm the fucking chief of medicine.
Because you're the one who's supposed to make the hardest decisions.
I froze. The tears were waiting, but there simply wasn't time to cry. It was amazing what happens to impossible when there just isn't space for it. Get Yangston and Braining on the easy cases, I commanded, and prep a 3rd patient for me in an operating room with them. I want an eye on as many surgeries as possible. I turned around to face a nurse at the desk, then scribbled a phone number on a sheet of paper. Call this house. Tell them to get everyone out to safety. She physically drew back in fear. All of our landlines are down, Doctor. Well, since I'm fresh out of carrier pigeons, use a cell phone. She fought back tears. God damn, it was annoying me. I can't. Why not? Because I gave you mine. I'm sorry. My eyes bulged. Well, does no one else at the desk have one? What is this, 2006? She winced. Not yet. I'm sorry. Oh yeah. Not wanting to look stupid, I stared her down like this was her fault. Then I raced into surgery. Does anyone have a cell phone that actually gets reception? I snapped at Dr. Matthews as we both ran down the hall.
No.
He gasped as he fell behind me.
It looks like the storm has completely cut off all cell reception.
I didn't have time to ponder whether a satellite phone existed anywhere in this godforsaken hospital. I was stitching up some kid's abdomen, staring at my watch and glancing across the OR at Braining and Yangston. Compartmentalize. I'm finished here. Nurse, take this kid to recovery. I have to make a phone. Patient's coding! The voice came from the far end of the room. Surprisingly, it was neither Braining nor Yangston, but a young resident that I knew would not endure into my original timeline. I raced across the OR to find the doctor was frozen in place. I'm sorry. She mumbled through her surgical mask. I saw something in the closet. My mind isn't... Able to realize that you've left forceps inside of a patient's arm? I shouted. When she didn't move, I dove in. Though it had been difficult at the time, I'd faced the same hospital ghost this woman couldn't handle. Nothing in front of them was impossible. But she had chosen to believe that as an excuse to herself. This is why I have no patience with people. But even when she had stabilized, the patient's temperature was abnormally high. I also noticed how swollen her abdomen appeared. This is why I'm such a good doctor. Seconds later, I was doing a damn good job of removing the girl's burst appendix, able to glance up at Braining and Yangston, but unable to do anything to help them. Those numbers are fine for an adult. Is this your first time working on a child? We performed the hemogram test, and you didn't even check the results. Yangston's face turned bright red against the white surgical mask.
You need to get the hell out of my OR, nurse.
Your patient's coding.
No!
Fuck. It was happening. My own patient's appendix was in a bad state, but I'd nearly finished.
What happened?
The scalpel shook in my hands. I could see the crash cart from the corner of my eye, recognizing an ID number of 8251913. As I knew I would. You cut his splenic artery, Doctor. Alt responded flatly.
I'm sorry. My hands are shaking. I'm so sorry.
I hate church. How do we even know that God is real? My father ran his fingers through his thinning hair. His nails were dirty. They were always dirty.
Going to church makes your pregnant mother stop nagging me for a whole hour each week, and that's all the proof of the divine I need.
He sighed as he plopped onto the couch next to me. I didn't understand what he meant, so I kept the scowl etched deeply into my face. I flinched when he tried to hug me. Daddy cleared his throat.
I didn't go to college like your mom did, so I never learned the best ways to convince people that they're wrong.
He shook his head slowly.
I don't know if adults understand church any more than 6-year-olds like you do, Ellie. But many adults are old enough and wise enough to know when we should stop thinking and just go along with things.
I kept my head turned away to show that he wasn't winning me over. I could hear him scratching his scalp in frustration.
Okay,
He continued, exasperated.
I'll give you my best answer about church. And then you have to put your shoes on and just go out the door with me, because that's the best you're getting. Do you understand?
I huffed.
I don't. It's impossible for me to give a reason why we should believe in God, Ellie. It seems like so many things in life are unfair, but here's the thing.
He put a great arm around me and pulled me close.
You and I are here, aren't we? Well, what guarantee did we have of that? Where was the proof that my spirit and your spirit would be together, or even exist at all? Yet it happened, somehow. God believed in us before we were us, and 2 souls existed where there was nothing at all before. So I don't think it's about us believing in God, not at first. God believed in us, and we're responding to that with everything in our lives.
I didn't understand his reasoning, but I felt his vulnerability, and I relaxed into his hug.
Your mom says that every action has a reaction, but I think it's backwards. At least with church stuff, every reaction leads to an action. Did you know there's a prayer about it?
I shook my head, pigtails bouncing.
The prayer says that in giving, we receive, in pardoning, we are pardoned, and in dying, we are born.
I finally turned around to look at him. How can we be born by dying? Isn't dying the end of all things? His face moved around in funny ways that I did not understand.
I don't think dying is the end. Did you know that every single person you've ever met is changed because of you? And everyone they meet is different because of them. The entire world exists in just this way, at this moment, because of everyone who ever lived and died. Remember what I told you about those trees in West Texas? You don't stop affecting people after death, Ellie.
I squirmed. So all dead people are ghosts that stay with us for the rest of our lives?
My little Ellie Bean. I don't see any other explanation.
I stared up at him with the kind of awe that only a child can have for their parent. So, who taught us to talk backwards to God? Where did that prayer come from? He furrowed his eyebrows and scratched his chin.
I believe, Ellie, that is called the Prayer of St. Francis.
I could feel my mind breaking when my patient started coding. She was the only one that time hadn't promised to take from me, and apparently that hope existed just to string me along. I breathed deeply, stopped trying to understand time itself, and focused on what was causing this girl's heart to fail. She was losing more blood than made sense for an appendectomy. What was wrong? The forceps. The damn resident must have damaged her arm during his panic procedure, and now she was hemorrhaging, possibly from a brachial artery. She was bleeding from 2 places at once, and it would take a miracle to manage both issues at the same time. Since I didn't believe in miracles, though, I'd have to rely on myself. And I'm a damn good doctor. I was stitching her up just in time to settle back into the outside world. Dr. Yangston was staring in frozen shock at the dead child below him, while a nurse held Dr. Braining steady as he sobbed over his own failure. Below me, the girl's heart monitor beat steadily. You have to give yourself room for forgiveness, Dr. Braining. Tell me that you hear me. He rolled his red-rimmed eyes all over the hallway, looking at everything but me. Tell me that you hear me. It's a simple request mastered by children who have yet to figure out fine art of toilet usage. Dr. Braining! He slowly focused on me.
I think I need to go be alone.
He muttered distractedly. I knew how this story ended. I know you're in a bad place, but I cannot monitor you every second. You need to take responsibility for self-care first, Dr. Braining. You need to avoid being alone for the next day. He finally found my eyes.
You're right, Dr. Scrit. I'm responsible for myself. It's all on me, all of it.
He deflated.
You can't hold me back forever. Please, let me go.
I wanted to shake him, scream at him, tell him that I knew what he was about to do. Most of all, I wanted to smack the shit out of him. But he was right. I couldn't hold him back forever. I checked his pockets for illicit pills but found none. What more could I do? I had a phone call to make. Dr. Braining, I want you to remember something, I commanded with a note of finality. He looked at me forlornly. If you insist on being so damn melancholy over things you can't change, then step up and take responsibility for the things that you can. Then, I turned and ran. I pulled out the cell phone and attempted to dial while moving at top speed. The call went through, and no one picked up. You've reached the Aphela's home, but we're gone. I screeched to a halt in front of a familiar-looking janitor emerging from a well-used closet. He held up a gentle hand with dirty fingernails, indicating that I needed to stop. I obeyed. He smiled sadly.
If you'd run into Huntington Bank across the street, you could have used their phone in time. But I'm sorry, it's too late. Your house is burned to the ground.
I turned and walked dazedly away. The last 26 years of my life had been taken from me just to have this moment. And I'd wasted it. No, that wasn't true. The entire rest of my life had been taken away because it would be totally impossible to pick up the thread of my old life by the time I finally arrived back in 2031. Everything in my life had been burned away in that damn fire, just like it had for Timmy. It was too much. I was breaking. I turned around, dove into that janitor's closet, and completely fucking lost it. I didn't care if anyone heard. I just wanted to know that no one could touch me, and that I would be completely alone as I finally broke and ugly cried my hope away. I had no desire to live after this moment. The concept of existing was too painful. Everything was over. I wanted my story to end. Eventually, though, I stopped crying. I was actually surprised to realize that the story kept going. I was so focused on where and when I was that my imagination simply couldn't conceive of an after, so I had assumed that there was none. Time, it seems, did not care for what I thought. So with nothing else in my script, I stood up, walked out the door, and continued to be the chief of medicine. Your doctors suck ass, the little girl explained as I checked her bandages. Your language sucks ass, young lady, I replied as I replaced the gauze. It was healing perfectly. I'd been the one who removed her appendix. Of course it was faultless. Why the hell did he leave forceps in me then? I'm only 12 years old, and even I know there was no reason to use that kind of equipment when my arm was just cut. I raised an eyebrow. Something about her frizzy hair, dark brown eyes, and edginess seemed so familiar. So you think you can do a better job in my operating room, kid? She shrugged. The bar's pretty low. I snorted. You survived a burst appendix. You're welcome. The girl nodded flippantly. Yeah, but that's your job. A better job would have been to notice the problem before it got so bad in the first place. I dropped my hands to my hips, exasperated. You think you've got this figured out? Yeah, she responded casually. Well, one day I will. You want to be a doctor? I shot back. Maybe, she answered, staring at her arm instead of me. But probably a nurse. Doctors are just nurses who get tired of having their hands dirty. I chuckled for the first time in recent memory, then looked down and read her chart once more. I stared back at her. Lydia? That's my name. The same information has been on your page this entire time. She responded. See, that's what I mean. You have to pay attention to what's happening before time runs out. I resolved to be kind to myself when she appeared in 2019. Young Ellie had been through a lot. I saw her for the first time when she was eating lunch with the other new recruits. I thought the moment would be a transcendental experience, but all I could focus on was how badly I missed being able to glide across the room without cracking my hips. She sat down next to Dr. Myron Caldwell, who quickly grabbed her sandwich, took a bite, and placed it out of reach. Ellie's face fell. Then she stood up, walked around the table, and picked up her own food. Dr. Caldwell called over Dr. Hassenfuss, who was easily the most attractive of the new class, and motioned for her to sit beside him. Ellie turned around to find that her seat had been taken. She wiped her eye, then sat down at a different table to finish her sandwich. Entirely alone. My stomach dropped. What a fucking wuss. I'd entirely forgotten about that moment, and felt as though I was watching a stranger. Was this really the class of 2019? I'd worked wonders with idiots before, but there was a limit. Even for doctors as good as me. How was I supposed to inspire this class? I can mold clay, but I can't mold shit. And what was I going to do with Ellie? I don't have time to get to know you, I explained to the assembled group. So make yourself stand out in some noteworthy way and I won't have to stress about it. See, I can be warm and supportive. I looked around at my noble crew. Dr. Falhar had an entire knuckle up his nostril. Dr. Brutson was chuckling to himself and ignoring me. And Dr. Caldwell reached out to pinch Dr. Hassenfuss's ass. She squeaked, turned red, and grinned at him. For fuck's sake. We had just come out of pediatric surgery, and the slapdick squad was acting like the job stopped when they clocked out. I huffed. These folks, and the patients they were half a suture away from killing, were lucky to have my nurturing guidance. 19 of you start today, and we've got a pool going with bets on how long each of you will last. I stifled a grin as I looked over at my shock charges, snorted, then turned and walked away. They hesitated. My stomach dropped as I realized they had no sense of respect. God damn. Things needed to improve quickly. You should know when to follow me and when to stay away, because I'm not going to waste time explaining what you should figure out on your own. They quickly caught up. As we rounded a corner, I turned to see Ellie getting elbowed to the back of the line. She accepted the abuse willingly. It was very clear that she was not close to any path that led to being the chief of medicine. She barely looked able to handle being a doctor. St. Francis was going to crush this weak little butterfly by week's end. My hand shook. Was this girl going to disrupt space-time because she couldn't deal with human interaction? My mind was racing. I never played favorites, but the years at St. Francis had taught me to accept whatever message the hospital was sending my way. It expects things from me, but gave me tools in return. I just hadn't thought about how badly I would need them on day one. Hell, the list of rules phenomenon was something I didn't even think about until a few people had dropped out. On some random day each year, a mysterious stack of papers would show up on my desk. I knew not to look at them. I would simply gather them up and hand them out, knowing that each list would manifest itself to the right person. I'd nearly forgotten that they'd showed up so soon in 2019. But in that moment, as I was walking down the hallway, I felt my pocket suddenly grow heavy with a stack of paper. Wordlessly, I grabbed the sheets and sent them behind me. Take one and pass it back, Dr. Endelman, I commanded offhandedly. I gave the group a moment to send them back, knowing that Ellie would be the lone person to be denied a paper, because she was the last in line. And because she was a wuss. You should have the list of expectations for St. Francis, I explained as I walked on, not needing to glance behind me to know that Ellie would be panicking. I printed 18 sets of rules so that you would have to challenge one another for them, knowing that one of you would get left behind. It was harsh, even for me, but I knew what Ellie was capable of, so I had to bitch slap the weakness out of her right now. If you cannot follow these rules, there will be no place for you in this hospital. It most likely means that you are unsuited to be a doctor and should consider a profession that demands a weaker mental aptitude. I stopped and turned around as though I was interested in the group, but only needed to watch Ellie. I'd observed the rest long ago, and the person we see least is ourselves. I saw sadness in her. One more tiny crack emerged in the kaleidoscope of fissures that spiderwebbed across my mind as I felt Timmy residing subconsciously in the back of her thoughts. Compartmentalize. And if you think that I'm the type to give second chances after a mistake, you're woefully underprepared for the world of medicine. I looked at each one in turn, hoping that my lesson had landed. Ellie still looked petrified. Dr. Falhar was still spelunking for that stubborn booger. Why do so many slapdicks want to be professionals? Shoveling elephant poop at the zoo is a perfectly necessary profession, and life would be so much easier if people had the decency to be honest about the future they plan for themselves. I waited for them to show some sort of initiative. Caldwell, though a douche, had at least been top 10 in his class at Johns Hopkins. Were all of them going to stare at me in mindless nihilism? Behind me, several unattended heart rate monitors beeped for attention. "Well," I shot out in exasperation. "Why are you all standing here? People are dying. Get to work!" I didn't feel bad when Dr. Caldwell screamed. The hospital had simply purged one person in exchange for sparing those who he would have killed in the years ahead due to his inadequacy. I watched the scene unfold from across the hall. Dr. Matthews looked terrified as he raced into the room, but the familiar janitor nodded calmly as he swept past me and closed the door behind him. Dr. Caldwell was going to die. Many years ago, my mind had learned to accept what it could not change. My heart was slower to adapt, but it became more calloused every day. I didn't follow the janitor as he opened the door and whisked Dr. Caldwell away on a gurney. Instead, I focused my efforts on Ellie as she walked out of the room a few moments later, thinking that she was being subtle. Of course, her bright red face was about as subtle as a sledgehammer to the testicles. She was way outside her comfort zone. I smiled. Time travel is the most baffling thing, until it's replaced by an even stranger reality. You learn to accept it, as people learn to accept all everyday miracles, until the fantastic so thoroughly pervades our lives that it finally becomes mundane. Humans did the exact same thing the day after the airplane, the rocket ship, and the smartphone were finally unleashed upon the unsuspecting species. They got up and went to work, just like every other day. And so did I, and so did the younger version of myself. At least she'd been trying to seem like she'd been working before I found her hiding in the closet, reading a list of stolen rules and looking guiltier than a teenage boy who'd been caught fucking a stuffed teddy bear. "Dr. Phalis," I interrupted, barely hiding my grin. "I'm shocked." I stared down at the blood-stained list of rules in her hands. Her mouth flapped around, but in her fear, she was unable to master the voice-to-words concept. "You took a list that wasn't yours and were nowhere to be found after your coworker experienced such an unnatural incident." I huffed through my nose. "It seems you're willing to do the unthinkable in the name of getting what you need. And Myron couldn't even follow the most important rule." She clenched her teeth. "I had my 4-year streak of predicting which incoming doctors will break the soonest. This'll ruin my chances in the office pool." She brought the story, because it was a very easy lie to her, and I had to turn around before she saw me break into a full smile. "Get to work, doctor. You've got 3 hours left on your shift, and those symptoms aren't going to Google themselves." I learned early on that surgery hurts, but it heals. This poor girl was plagued by a paralyzing case of self-doubt, and there was no anesthesia that could be applied during its removal. But that girl needed all the confidence she could get if she wanted to survive the years ahead, and I cared too much to hold myself back the best treatment, even if the short-term cost felt scary. I considered our little conversation to be a win. Besides, she would get over it. I was certain. Years passed. Each day, I hurt a little more because I can't stop thinking what I would do if I could go back, and I know that I would probably still make the same choice. That was the moment I could feel one of the largest remaining pieces of my charged heart fissure and fall away. I turned aside because I could not afford to let her see my brokenness. Not now. Not after everything. "Ellie, why do you think that St. Francis Hospital would have such an arbitrary set of rules for its interns?" "The rules come from somewhere beyond us. I understand that now. We're just here to follow them." This girl had come a long way. I was the one now, half a breath from tears. I shook my head as a distraction. "No, Dr. Phalis, that isn't true. What was the first rule? Never, under any circumstances, share your copy of the rules with anyone else. calm and focused once more. I stared at her and raised an eyebrow. And how does that make any sense? A swell of smugness rose up as I watched her stumble. It was important to see. Not all of us were going to make it. That much is true, I answered dismissively. We've seen more than enough evidence of that tonight, but you're wrong about the rule coming from somewhere else. I bore my eyes into her. She was speechless. I don't understand. Then you're starting to get it. I shot back, regaining my arrogant groove. You weren't top of your class, Dr. Phalis, not even close, but you're at least smart enough to be a doctor. Can you attempt to figure this out? She said nothing. It was a calculated move, and I respected it. I shook my head to mask my pride in her. Then I made the leap. Did you really never make the connections, Dr. Phalis? The trial of jumping off a roof, judgment from an authoritative janitor, multiple different rules about burning children. Her jaw fell. The first rule prohibits the sharing of rules because no one has the same set. Each doctor is faced with his or her own list of restrictions, and most aren't up to the challenge. Her mouth opened and closed 3 times before she could conjure a response. Every rule is just for me? I took off my glasses and bore my eyes into her. People think that this hospital wants to destroy them, when in reality, each person is given every tool needed for survival. I snorted. It's impossible to stop most individuals' desire to kill themselves. She attempted and failed to connect the dots. But Rule 4, why did it tell me not to touch your Reese's peanut butter cups? She almost figured it out. Almost. But still, I hid the truth. Because it's my favorite candy. She nodded slowly. Mine too. I waited half a second longer, wondering if she'd finally grasp the truth and possibly break the cycle. But it was not to be. I put my glasses back on and revealed all that I could. You're going to ask what this place is. I've survived St. Francis far longer than most. That's why people expect me to tell them. I waited, choosing each of my next words very carefully. So before you say that you want me to tell you the truth, you should understand this fact. I stared her down until she was finally turning away from me again. It's important for me to have the upper hand. There are things that I can't know and things that I don't know. Embracing these ideas as a strength instead of a weakness is the reason I've endured where others have not. The silence meant that she only understood all of some of what I'd said, not some of it, and only some of all of it. Such is the condition of being an enlightened physician. Can you see the individual rules on each doctor's paper? She asked, breaking the silence. I smiled. It was true that the other doctors had their own mysterious list of rules, but she still didn't get it. No, but I can see what's written on their faces, which is the same thing. I don't get it, she answered flatly. I sighed in disappointment, throwing her one more bone. Do you remember when I reminded you of Rule 9? Her mind whirled with the stupid brilliance of rote memorization. You told me the morgue needed 13 cadavers at all times, she answered confidently. No, I lied. You told me that. I acted like I had known the entire time, and you responded to my confidence. Each person's list of rules is their own battle to fight. To be blunt, I'd rather see the doctors fail themselves through inadequacy than see the patient suffer because someone was unable to live up to their own unearned arrogance. She blinked. I'd like to earn my arrogance. I liked that answer. I liked it a lot. The good news is that I think you might have endurance to survive the unusually lengthy journey it would take for you to achieve earned arrogance. My heart broke with pride at the unseen path. Then the door burst open with an unplanned emergency that defines a physician's everyday schedule, and we moved on. She never asked how I knew that the trial of jumping off a roof, judgment from an authoritative janitor, or the extreme importance of burning children defined her life. She didn't question why I even knew what those rules were in the first place. The truth had been there in plain sight, but had gone unnoticed until the second time around. Had it really not been obvious? The next big change was coming soon. It infused my thoughts like damp air whispering of a coming storm. I thought I was ready for it, which proved that some lessons are never learned. I had been quietly following Ellie through the same hallway that had drawn me in years earlier. On this particular day, though, she only noticed a familiar janitor haunting its walls. We'd both seen him periodically throughout the years, rarely talking and never aging. This time, however, he looked right at her and spoke.
It's time to make a choice, Ellie.
He explained softly. The most successful people are often seen as a breed apart, achieving lofty heights because they're built of different stuff. Dr. Phalis disproved this by dampening her pants as possibly the greatest moment of her life began to unfold. She didn't think she was quite ready to be chief of medicine, which meant that it was time to start. The janitor turned aside and looked toward a space in the wall that had only occasionally held a physical door. It stood there now, slightly ajar. The numbers were etched deeply into the wood, warped and worn like they had been there for years. "Why does it say 3191? She asked. He smiled sadly.
It's your opportunity to go backwards.
She was weak, which meant it was the moment with her greatest chance to achieve strength. "Where does it lead?" she asked in a shaking voice.
Rural Missouri.
He continued inexorably.
Far from any town, about 30 minutes away from Drisking.
He raised his eyebrows.
But that's not the real question now, is it?
She shut her eyes. "When does it lead?" He waited until she was strong enough for eye contact before he continued.
August 25th, 2005.
She started to cry. "Can it go any earlier?"
No.
He responded sharply. "I'd have very little time to prepare."
The world turns on what people do with very little.
She wiped her eyes, deciding if she was going to be strong or weak. "Okay," she responded, voice shaking. "I need to go back. I can be ready in a few days. Where will I find the door?" The janitor stood very still.
Right here. Right now.
She flirted with weakness. No, I'm not ready right this second. I need to prepare if my life is going to change." She was losing the battle for herself and had already been defeated in the don't look like a mucusy mess competition. He folded his hands firmly.
If you don't go now, the door disappears. You'll never see it again.
She fell into a kneeling position. Though certain that she was ready to take over as chief of medicine, I was unimpressed in this moment. "Okay," she whimpered. "Okay, I'll go now. When I come back, will the world be different?" He was very quiet. Then,
You can only go back the hard way, Ellie.
that's when I first became aware of the tears covering my own face. "That was 26 years ago. I can't lose that much of my life," he sighed.
Yes, you can. People lose that much every day.
I covered my mouth to hide the sobs. "Well, I don't understand. Is my body going to reverse in age, or will I just look like this and die 26 years earlier?" I heaved, overpowered by great, silent crying, barely able to keep quiet.
You don't get any extra time, Ellie.
He continued in his commanding voice.
Any year that you live twice takes away from what would have been.
He looked over at me, making direct eye contact for the first time. He seemed absolutely demanding of obedience. But he didn't let her know I was there. She dry heaved. But will it be like the last time I went back? Or will I be able to change things now?" He smiled. I couldn't tell if the expression was sad because it was happy, or happy because it was sad.
The past will be yours to change as you decide. The world will be different as a result of your choices.
She looked up, suddenly quite confident. I melted to the floor.
Ellie,
He pressed.
you always knew that last part was true, right?
She finally sobbed, loudly. I took the opportunity to let my own cries overlap hers. For just a moment, they matched up perfectly. She leaned forward, pressing her hands onto the ground. "I need time to process this."
You don't have time, and you don't need it. Right now, you have to step through that door or walk away forever.
He reached out, grabbed the knob, and began to pull it shut. We like to pretend that grave decisions take time because it allows us to believe that deep thought changes our basest instincts. But we are our truest selves in short moments of high consequence. She leapt up and squeezed through the door just as he closed it behind her. And when he immediately pulled it open again, there was no one on the other side. We were alone, for the first time in 26 years. There weren't two of me in the world, running parallel tracks on a journey that was neither predetermined nor authored by our choices.
You almost broke the moment.
He said while staring at the wooden frame. Then he turned to face me.
She was the stronger one today.
I looked up at him, the end of the story at hand. I wondered if I had really believed that the final scene was going to be more glorious than this. It doesn't matter, I huffed. It's done now. I looked away, wiped the tears and snot on my wrist, and walked past him.
It does matter, Ellie, and it's never done.
I was glad to be facing away from him as I discovered that there were still tears left in reserve.
Every person you failed and every person you saved don't get to walk away from what you did here each day for 26 years.
I attempted, unsuccessfully, to sniff all the snot up from my upper lip back into my nose. Well, my story can be done, for better or worse or whatever.
Is that the side of the door you're choosing?
There was a hint of something in his voice that I could not place. It stirred something between hope and fear in my chest, and I did not like the feeling. Slowly, I turned around to look at him. The door was still ajar. Where does that door...
Not the right question.
When does that door...
Please, don't ask questions to which you already know the answers.
The space between us froze with a crystalline energy that was both gorgeous and deadly. I'm an old woman. My story is finished. He shook his head.
Stories don't finish.
He continued, lips pressed together.
Not when there are people still living the effects of what's been written and unwritten.
When I spoke again, my voice was very brittle, as though ready to splinter along its weakest edges. I tried to fight time. It took my whole life. I took in a deep, trembling breath. I have nothing left to show for it.
You have your whole life to show for it.
He responded firmly.
Every day will be lived, whether you spend that in regret or happiness has no bearing on the passage of time. As long as you are still breathing, it is impossible for a past decision to take your life.
Another frozen moment came, and then it passed. I'm 64 years old, I responded wearily. It's time for me to retire. I turned away from the janitor and the door, and I walked.
Wait.
I stopped, but did not turn back.
You didn't close the door.
I remained facing away from him. There isn't always a strong choice and a weak choice. Sometimes simply making a decision is a sign of strength.
Well then?
He responded with a hint of desperation. I paused. Then I walked away from room 3191, but did not close the door behind me, and headed down the hall to a place where I suspected that I was needed. Emergencies had a way of finding me. If you don't let the past go, then the past will never let go of you. Hello everyone. I have had an influx of new subscribers recently, so you might be confused as to what this is. And what it is my book club. I like to come in at the end of long series and things like that where I feel like there's a lot to be said that I can't just mention in my pinned comment, and talk about my thoughts, what it was like to make it, what I was thinking about certain aspects of the story, sound design, and stuff like that. And I just have a little chat, and it's been dubbed by me and my loving subscribers as Rom's Book Club. So gather round if you're interested in this sort of thing. I'm going to be kind of picking apart the story, going over some of the themes, how I made the story, what the struggles were, and things like that. If not, the story's finished, so you can click away now. This story, I very greatly enjoyed. I loved almost every moment of it. Some of it struck me in a way that pulled at my emotions in a way I didn't expect, but other than that, I really did have a fantastic time with this story. Some stories drag on for me, but this one was very long. It was 15 parts, which I put into 5 videos, and even though it was so long, it didn't exactly become old for me, kind of like the social worker series did, but they were still good stories. It's just, this story did not drag for me in any way. It was pretty fast-paced, but in a way that I very much so enjoyed. When I got to the part of the story where it suddenly became apparent that the whole time the main character and Dr. Scrit are the same person, I very greatly started to doubt whether or not I had done the story right. When I started the story, I had read about 7 of the parts, and I was like, wow, I'm 7 parts in, that's pretty far, and I really like it, and so I went ahead and got permission to do it. Sometimes this can really come back to bite you, and thankfully, I don't think it really bit me that much, because the only thing I really had to be concerned about was that I voice acted them so differently. Being that Dr. Scrit, I gave a southern accent. I tried to give her an Appalachian accent, because it's where the story takes place, and also where I'm from. I'm not sure how well I did because I don't have a very thick accent, but I at least think it made her sound interesting, and a lot of people seem to actually like how she sounded, so I don't regret doing that. And another reason I don't regret doing that, even though they're the same person, is that you'd be able to figure that out way too soon. I think that it was a really impactful twist, and I personally did not see it coming until it was pretty much happening. Let me know if you saw it coming, because I feel like it was done in a really good way, personally. And I love stories like that. I've always been a huge fan of time travel stories, things like Doctor Who. I've always loved that show. So this story really became just better and better for me as I went on. I think that I got away, personally, with having the accent on Scrit because she had to try to differentiate herself somehow. Because if you'll notice in the story, there is some sort of unspoken, you can't tell your younger self that you're her. For some reason, that's like a rule that can't be broken. Otherwise, this loop, this time loop that they're stuck in, reliving over and over, wouldn't exist, right? So I at least think that it makes sense, and I am glad that I chose to do the accent. With that being said, I hope that my intention came across in the last part, after we realized the time thing in the beginning, how it's a loop. The rest of the story I decided to voice act so that when the main character, Ellie, was pretending to be Dr. Scrit, because Dr. Scrit is a persona that she came up with within this time loop. You know, it's all paradoxical and it's not exactly clear, but as far as time travel goes, she came up with Dr. Scrit so that she wasn't just running around like, I'm Ellie Fearless, blah, and so that she couldn't come to realize that that was her. So I tried to make it sound like sometimes it really is just an act. In the beginning of when she realizes she's Dr. Scrit, she has no accent. And then whenever she speaks out loud to other people who know her as Dr. Scrit in the past, she will use her accent. And so I tried to make it very apparent that she was coming into playing this character. And I'd like to know in the comments if some of you will let me know if that came across. Because I do realize that it might have just sounded like sometimes I forgot to speak with the accent. But I really did try to be very precise and deliberate with where I put the accent. Sometimes when she was lost in her thoughts, even after she'd become Dr. Scrit, I tried to make it apparent that she was just losing how much she knew she needed to act like Dr. Scrit by not using the accent and vice versa. And then eventually, when she got much older and she'd been acting like Dr. Scrit for so long, the accent was almost always there because she'd gotten so used to it. I really want to know if that part of the story made sense. Because everything else, I feel like, wasn't hard to work around with the time travel. It did take quite a long time to go back and get all those different parts to put in, because there are several scenes that are redone, but from Dr. Scrit's point of view. And that took some time, but other than that, it wasn't that bad. I really like, by the way, that the author did that. It was really cool to see this cold, heartless person that had been so mean to the main character up until this part. We're suddenly able to see what she thought all those times. She was being such a bitch. We're finally able to see how sometimes she was actually herself really suffering. I think that if it wasn't for the time loop, Dr. Scrit would not have been a very fleshed out character. I think that she would have just been the stereotypical bitch character. But after all of that crazy development, I really have come to like the main character, even though I was kind of in the boat that a lot of other people were in at first, where she's kind of an asshole. And I guess I'll address now why I think a lot of people thought that. So please correct me in the comments if this is not what you were thinking, but I was thinking in the part where we learn that it is her fault that her brother died in a fire. While I was acting that out, I was thinking, when I was 12 years old, I would definitely know better than this. I remember what I was like when I was 12, because she was 12 when that happened, and I absolutely had the brain power to not do something stupid like that. I know it was like, oh, she was so upset, she was so mad, she didn't mean it, but still, I feel like that part would have been more impactful and less of a main character deterrent. You know, like people wouldn't dislike the main character so much if Ellie had been a little younger. That's really my only big nitpick with this whole story, is that part, it's so easy to start hating the main character because she's definitely old enough to know better, and that's just my opinion. Let me know if that's why you came to dislike her as well. I did wrestle with whether or not I was going to share certain things in this book club, because I knew I was going to do one, because I so badly wanted to talk about how cool I thought that twist was, and I wanted to put my opinions about it out there. But also, one of the things that made this story a little hard for me to do around the middle is it hit too close to home. I'm gonna share some personal stuff now that has to do with, like, that ties into the story a little bit. So if you're not interested in that, click away, I guess. But I have always been really stricken by the responses I get from people that have lost loved ones on my stories, because I have a large amount of stories that are about parents losing their children, because, with me being a female narrator, it just so happens that a lot of the stories for women are about mothers losing their sons and daughters. And I can't even fully describe what it feels like for someone to be in the comments talking about how they lost their son or daughter, their loved one, their wife, their husband. I can't believe that I have the privilege of these people coming to me and being like, your story was so good, it made me cry. And sometimes it's not a privilege, and it's more of a, I'm so sorry that happened to you, and I just mostly hope that I didn't trigger you in any way. So it's two sides of the same coin, because on one hand, I feel really flattered that they'll comment and tell me how much my story touched them, and then I'll feel like absolute crap because I just hope that they're doing okay. And so this ties in because I have been greatly avoiding doing stories that have to do with siblings dying, because I lost my brother when I was 12, actually. So the story, it hit too close to home. When I was 12 years old, my big brother died in a car accident. And even though it's not anywhere near the same situation, I'm sure you'll understand if you've lost someone that the reminder is just enough, you know? And when I was recording that part, it was a crazy coincidence to me, because on March 31st was the 9-year anniversary of my brother's death, and the first, so the day after that, was the 7-year anniversary of my stepdad. And I recorded that part with the fire on the 1st. So I was like, really? Of course this is when this would happen, when I would be recording this part. So it was very emotional for me, and I mean, that's good and bad. Good because I really was crying when I was recording that part. You know, the part where the sister is screaming up to the balcony, telling her brother to jump. I was actually almost crying, you know? And good because authentic experience, but, you know, bad because it made me really sad. So this story really did get me in some parts. And that's about all I wanted to say about it. I really liked this story. I'm really thankful I got to narrate it. I think that the author was very nice to let me narrate it with just a book plug in it, you know, because I have plugged their book in every part. Because usually when an author's coming out with a book, it's just a hard no, because they'll have a contract written up with a company, or maybe it's so popular that another narrator has paid them to not let anyone else narrate it. It could be all kinds of things. But the author was sweet enough to let me do the story, you know, with just plugging to the book, and I'm very thankful for that. And I don't think they'll ever hear this, but if they do, I just want you to know that I am very, very thankful that you let me do this story. I hope you all enjoyed it too, listeners. And I would love to know what you thought about it in the comments. I read every comment, even if I don't reply to them all. I sometimes just can't think of a good reply, but I do my best. So let me know what you thought, if you have any nitpicks, if anything didn't make sense. And I hope you have a beautiful day.